The grand ballroom of the Horizon Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and the quiet buzz of New York's elite. In one corner stood Alex Chen, a 35-year-old tech billionaire who had built his empire from a simple app idea in his garage. Tonight was supposed to be just another charity gala, the kind where wealthy people gathered to write checks and pat themselves on the back. But fate had other plans. Alex adjusted his perfectly tailored suit, checking his reflection in a nearby glass wall. His net worth of $3.2 billion made him one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. He had everything money could buy: penthouses in 3 cities, a collection of rare cars, and a private jet that he used like others use taxis. Getting bored of these events, aren't you? A familiar voice cut through his thoughts. It was Robert Wang, another tech billionaire and Alex's longtime business rival. They had known each other since college, where their competition had started over a programming contest. Now they competed over everything from market shares to charity donations. "These events serve their purpose," Alex replied, taking a sip of his champagne. The taste felt flat tonight, just like his mood. Something was missing, but he couldn't put his finger on what. Robert smiled, but it wasn't his usual competitive grin. "You know what's funny? We stand here, writing million-dollar checks, thinking we understand the world. But when was the last time you bought groceries yourself? Or rode the subway? Or worried about making rent?" Alex raised an eyebrow. "What's your point?" "I have a proposition for you." Robert leaned closer, lowering his voice. "A bet, if you will. 1 month living as an ordinary person. No access to your wealth, no fancy apartments, no connections, just $1,000 to your name." Alex laughed, but Robert's face remained serious. "You can't be serious." "Oh, but I am. If you make it through the month without breaking character or using your resources, I'll donate $100 million to any charity you choose. If you fail, you donate the same amount to my foundation." The room suddenly felt warmer. Alex's mind raced with possibilities. $100 million could do incredible things for the education programs he supported. Plus, how hard could it be? People lived ordinary lives every day. "And how would we verify this?" Alex asked, his curiosity piqued. "I have a team that can monitor things discreetly. You'll need to work, find your own place, handle your own problems. Real life, Alex, no shortcuts." The challenge in Robert's voice triggered something in Alex. All his life, he had never backed down from a challenge. It had made him who he was. But this was different. This wasn't about coding or business strategies. This was about stepping into a world he had left behind long ago. "You seem hesitant," Robert prodded. "Afraid of leaving your comfort zone." That did it. Alex straightened his back and looked Robert in the eye. 1 month starting when?" "Tomorrow morning." "I'll have the paperwork ready. We'll need to keep this quiet. No press, no social media. Just a genuine experiment." As they shook hands, Alex felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. The competitive part of him was already planning how to win this bet. But a smaller, quieter voice wondered if he was about to learn something far more valuable than any business lesson. That night, as he looked out from his penthouse window at the glittering city below, Alex realized this bet could be exactly what he needed. A break from the artificial world he lived in. A chance to see life from a different perspective. Little did he know, this bet would become the turning point that would reshape not just his view of the world, but his entire legacy. He spent the night organizing things, making arrangements for his temporary disappearance from the business world. As he packed a small bag with basic clothes, his phone buzzed with a message from Robert. "Remember, $1,000 and your wits are all you get. Good luck." Looking at his closet full of designer suits, Alex picked out the most basic clothes he owned. Tomorrow, he would step into a world where his bank account wouldn't matter, where his name wouldn't open doors, where he would be just another face in the crowd. As he drifted off to sleep in his luxury bed for the last time in a month, he smiled, thinking how easy this would be. After all, he had built himself up from nothing once before. How different could things be now? He had no idea that this bet was about to show him a side of life he had forgotten existed and teach him lessons that all his billions never could. The morning sun peeked through the dusty windows of Alex's new home, a tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn that smelled faintly of old carpet and someone else's cooking. Gone were the Egyptian cotton sheets and memory foam mattress. Instead, he sat on a creaky bed that came with the furnished apartment, staring at the peeling wallpaper across the room. His first night had been rough. The neighbors upstairs seemed to be practicing their tap dancing routine at midnight, and the radiator made sounds he'd never heard before. But that was just the beginning of his reality check. Opening his worn wallet, Alex counted his money again. $897 left after paying the first week's rent. The landlord had looked at him suspiciously when he paid in cash, but at least he had a roof over his head. Looking at his reflection in the bathroom's scratched mirror, he barely recognized himself in the $15 thrift store jeans and plain white t-shirt. Okay, first task, grocery shopping, he muttered to himself. How hard could it be? He'd built a tech empire. Surely he could handle buying food. With confidence in his step, he headed to the nearest supermarket. 2 hours later, that confidence had evaporated like morning dew. Standing in the checkout line, Alex realized he'd have to put back half the items in his cart. Who knew organic vegetables could eat up so much of a budget? The teenage cashier looked bored as Alex awkwardly returned the fancy olive oil and premium coffee beans, replacing them with store-brand alternatives. "That'll be $78.45, she said, snapping her gum. Alex felt a strange knot in his stomach as he handed over the cash. Just yesterday, he wouldn't have blinked at spending thousands on a dinner. Now, watching the money leave his wallet made him genuinely anxious. The real adventure began when he tried to carry all his groceries home. He'd always had someone to drive him around or deliver things. Now, juggling 4 heavy bags, he realized the subway station was 6 blocks away. By the time he reached his apartment, his arms were shaking and he was drenched in sweat. That afternoon, he decided to explore his new neighborhood. Without his usual driver, he had to figure out public transportation. The subway map looked like a complicated puzzle, and he stood there studying it until an elderly lady took pity on him. "First time in the city, dear?" she asked kindly. Alex felt his face flush. "Is it that obvious?" "Don't worry, we all started somewhere. Here, let me show you how to get downtown." As she explained the color-coded lines and transfers, Alex felt a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. In his normal life, people came to him for advice. Now, he was the one who needed help with basic things. The subway ride itself was an eye-opener. Squeezed between a construction worker and a nurse still in her scrubs, Alex watched people from all walks of life. A street musician played guitar at the other end of the car, his voice carrying a song about better days. A mother helped her child with homework on her lap. 2 teenagers shared earbuds, lost in their own world. These were the same trains running under his penthouse all along, filled with stories he'd never bothered to notice. That evening, trying to make dinner in his tiny kitchenette, Alex burned his first attempt at pasta. The smoke alarm went off, bringing his neighbor to knock on his door. Instead of the angry confrontation he expected, the neighbor, a retired teacher, ended up giving him some basic cooking tips and even shared some of his own dinner. "Everyone needs a little help sometimes," the teacher said with a gentle smile that reminded Alex of his grandfather. Lying in bed that night, listening to the city sounds that felt so different from street level, Alex thought about his old life. He'd always prided himself on being self-made, on climbing to the top through hard work. But had he forgotten what the climb itself felt like? His phone, now a basic model instead of his usual smartphone, showed several missed calls from Robert. The rules allowed 1 check-in call per week, but Alex didn't call back. Instead, he made a list of things he needed to figure out: finding a job, learning to cook, understanding the subway system, and most importantly, making his dwindling funds last. As he drifted off to sleep, the sound of sirens in the distance and the gentle hum of his neighbor's television through the thin walls, Alex realized something surprising. He felt more alive than he had in years. Scared and uncomfortable, yes, but undeniably alive. With only $563 left in his pocket, Alex knew he needed to find a job fast. After a week of walking around the neighborhood, dropping off applications at every help-wanted sign he saw, he finally got a call back from a small coffee shop called Morning Light. The owner, an older woman everyone called Mrs. Lee, gave him a stern look during the interview. "No experience making coffee, you say?" She crossed her arms, studying him carefully. "But you seem eager to learn. Be here tomorrow at 5 a.m. sharp. We'll see how you do." That first morning shift hit him like a truck. Alex had never woken up this early, not even for his biggest business deals. His hands shook as he tried to learn the difference between a latte and a cappuccino. The espresso machine seemed more complicated than any tech startup he'd ever launched. No, Mrs. Lee shook her head, watching him struggle with the milk steamer. "You're thinking too much. Feel the rhythm of it. Listen to the sound. Making coffee is an art, not a science." By mid-morning, his feet were killing him. Who knew standing for hours could be so exhausting? But something unexpected happened as he fumbled through orders and apologized for mistakes. People were kind. Regular customers patiently waited as he figured out the register. His coworker, a college student named Ray, showed him tricks for remembering complex orders. "Everyone's new once," Ray said, showing him how to draw simple designs in latte foam. "You should have seen me when I started. I spilled an entire pitcher of milk on my first day." Then he met her. A woman rushed in during the morning rush, looking exhausted but somehow still smiling. "The usual, please," she said, digging through her bag for change. Ray whispered, "Medium vanilla latte, extra shot for Miss Chen. She's a nurse at the local hospital." Alex tried his best to make the drink perfect, remembering Mrs. Lee's lessons about listening to the milk steaming. When he handed it over, Miss Chen took a sip and her eyes lit up. "This is actually really good," she said, surprised. "Are you new here?" "I come in every morning, and I've never seen you before." First week, Alex admitted, "Still learning the ropes." "Well, you're doing great," she encouraged, dropping her spare change in the tip jar. "See you tomorrow." As the days passed, Alex found himself looking forward to the morning rushes. He learned customers' names and their stories. There was the firefighter who always ordered a black coffee before his shift, the teacher who needed her chai tea with exactly 1 pump of vanilla, and the construction workers who came in as a group, joking and sharing stories about their families. Miss Chen became a bright spot in his mornings. She would sometimes stay for a few minutes, sharing stories about her night shifts at the hospital. She was working extra hours to help her mother with medical bills, yet she never complained. Her resilience amazed him. "You know what keeps me going?" she told him one quiet morning. "The little moments of kindness. Like when a patient squeezes my hand to say thank you, or when someone holds the elevator for me when I'm running late. It's the small things that make life beautiful." Those words stuck with Alex. In his old life, he had always chased big moments, major deals, record profits, headline-making acquisitions. But here, in this small coffee shop, he was learning about a different kind of wealth. One rainy morning, when Miss Chen came in looking particularly tired, Alex added a small heart design to her latte foam. The smile it brought to her face was worth more than any business deal he'd ever closed. "Life's funny sometimes," Mrs. Lee said to him one evening as they were closing up. "We think we know exactly who we are and what we want. Then something changes, and we see everything differently." Alex looked around the coffee shop, at the worn but comfortable chairs, the walls covered with local artists' work, the regular customers who had become familiar faces. In just a few weeks, this place had started to feel more real than his sleek corporate office ever did. That night, as he counted his tips and added them to his carefully managed budget, Alex realized he hadn't thought about his billions all day. Instead, he'd been thinking about perfecting his light art, about Miss Chen's kind eyes, about the stories his customers shared, and about the simple joy of creating something with his own hands that made people smile. The bet that had started as a challenge to his pride was turning into something else entirely, a window into a world where wealth was measured not in dollars, but in moments of genuine human connection. 2 weeks into his new life, Alex was settling into a routine he never thought possible. His hands had developed small calluses from working the espresso machine, and he could now make perfect heart designs in latte foam. But life had other plans for testing his resolve. That morning started like any other. The regulars came and went, the coffee machine hummed its familiar tune, and Mrs. Lee was teaching him how to bake their famous blueberry muffins. Then Miss Chen walked in, but something was different. Her usual warm smile was missing, replaced by worried eyes and trembling hands. "The usual?" Alex asked, already reaching for her cup. She nodded absently, then sat in the corner booth, something she never did. Usually, she'd grab her coffee and rush to catch the bus to the hospital. Alex watched as she stared at her phone, biting her lip. During his break, he walked over to her table. "Everything okay?" Miss Chen looked up, see she'd been crying. "My mom," she said softly. "She needs surgery. The doctors found something during her last checkup." She took a shaky breath. "The treatment she needs, it's specialized. Insurance won't cover most of it." Alex felt his heart sink. In his old life, writing a check would have solved this problem instantly. But now, standing here in his coffee-stained apron, he felt helpless. "How much?" he asked before he could stock himself. $75,000, she whispered, the number hanging heavy in the air. "I've been picking up extra shifts, but—" She wiped her eyes quickly. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be dumping this on you. You've got your own life to worry about." That night, Alex couldn't sleep. He paced his small apartment, thinking about Miss Chen's mother, about the bet, about the millions sitting untouched in his accounts. The rules were clear: no accessing his wealth, no revealing his identity. But what good was winning a bet if it meant watching someone suffer? The next few days were torture. He watched Miss Chen come in looking more exhausted each morning, now working double shifts to save money. She'd stopped buying coffee, but Alex made her drinks anyway, marking them as his employee benefit. Then one morning she didn't come in at all. Ray, who lived in her neighborhood, said he'd seen an ambulance outside her building the night before. "Her mom collapsed," Ray explained. "They're at Central Hospital now." Alex's hands shook as he made drinks that morning. Every time the door chimed, he'd hoped it would be Miss Chen. Mrs. Lee noticed his distraction and pulled him aside. "Sometimes," she said wisely, "life presents us with moments where we must choose between what is right and what is easy." She patted his shoulder. "The heart knows what to do, even when the mind is confused." That evening, Alex sat in his apartment, staring at his basic phone. One call to Robert could end this. He could reveal everything, forfeit the bet, and help Miss Chen's mother. But something held him back. It wasn't just about the money anymore. Instead, he did something different. He talked to Mrs. Lee, Ray, and the regular customers. He shared Miss Chen's story. Soon, the entire neighborhood knew. The firefighter started a collection at his station. The teacher brought in donations from her school. The construction workers spread the word at their sites. The tip jar at Morning Light became a donation box. Local businesses put up posters. The neighborhood's Facebook group shared a fundraising page. Even the grumpy old man who always complained about his coffee brought in an envelope full of cash. "It's not much," he grumbled, "but nobody should lose their mother because they can't afford treatment." Alex watched in amazement as the community rallied together. People who barely had enough for themselves gave what they could. A local band organized a benefit concert in the park. Children set up lemonade stands. The neighborhood's monthly street fair became a fundraising event. One morning, about a week later, Miss Chen finally returned to the coffee shop. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, but she was smiling. "I don't know how to thank everyone," she said, looking at the donation box overflowing with community support. "The hospital called yesterday. They're going to start Mom's treatment next week. We're still short, but—" "How short?" asked Mrs. Lay. "About 20,000, Miss Chen replied. "But we'll figure something out. The community has already done so much." Alex felt the weight of his secret identity more than ever. $20,000 was nothing to him, yet it meant everything to this family. As he watched Miss Chen hug Mrs. Lay, thanking her for organizing the fundraiser, he realized that sometimes the greatest impact comes not from grand gestures, but from bringing people together for a common cause. That night, alone in his apartment, Alex made a decision that would change everything, but not in the way anyone expected. The next morning, Alex walked to the coffee shop earlier than usual. The sky was just beginning to lighten, and the streets were quiet except for early delivery trucks. He had barely slept, his mind racing with an idea that felt both terrifying and right. Mrs. Lee was already there, preparing the morning's first batch of pastries. She took one look at his face and said, "You've made a decision." "I think I have," Alex replied, helping her arrange muffins in the display case. "But I need your advice." Over the next hour, as the morning sun slowly filled the coffee shop, Alex shared his story with Mrs. Lee, everything except his real identity. He told her about feeling torn between the rules of the bet and his desire to help, about watching the community come together, and about his growing realization that maybe there was a different way to solve this. Mrs. Lee listened quietly, her hands working steadily as she kneaded dough for the day's bread. When he finished, she smiled. "You know," she said, "my grandmother used to say that when we help others grow, we grow ourselves. But sometimes the help people need isn't what we first think it is." Before Alex could respond, the bell above the door chimed. It was Ray, arriving for his shift, followed by their first customers of the day. The morning rush began, but Alex's mind kept returning to Mrs. Lee's words. Throughout the day, he watched the community in action. A local artist brought in paintings to sell, donating all proceeds to Miss Chen's fund. The owner of the bookstore next door organized a reading event. Even the kids from the nearby school had set up a craft sale. During his lunch break, Alex walked around the neighborhood. He passed the small grocery store where he now shopped, waving to the owner who always set aside slightly bruised fruits at a discount for struggling families. He saw the laundromat where people shared detergent and helped each other fold clothes while sharing stories about their days. Near the park, he stopped to watch a group of elderly residents teaching young kids how to play chess. One of the regular coffee shop customers, a retired accountant, was giving free financial advice to a young couple at a folding table. That's when it hit him. The solution wasn't just about money, it was about connecting resources with needs. Returning to the coffee shop, Alex noticed Miss Chen sitting in her usual corner, making calls between sips of coffee. He watched as she thanked someone for their donation, her voice tired but grateful. During a quiet moment, he approached her table. "Can I ask you something?" he said, sitting down. "What's the hardest part of all this?" She thought for a moment. "You know, it's not just the money. It's feeling so alone in the struggle." Before all this, she gestured to the donation box and fundraising posters. "I felt like I was the only one dealing with something this big. Now," she smiled softly, "now I know I'm not alone." That matters more than anything. Alex spent his evening break making calls from the back alley, using his basic phone. He contacted former co-workers who owed him favors, carefully avoiding any mention of his current situation. By the end of his shift, he had lined up 3 job interviews for Miss Chen at hospitals offering better pay and full family health coverage. The next morning, he casually mentioned these opportunities to her. "My friend from high school works in hospital administration," he explained when she asked how he knew about them. "I hope you don't mind, but I told her about your situation." Miss Chen's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of hope. "I don't know what to say. Thank you. Just, thank you." That weekend, the community organized a street fair for the fundraiser. The entire block was transformed. Food stands filled the air with amazing smells, local bands played music, and children ran around with face paint. Alex worked at a coffee stand Mrs. Lee had set up, watching as neighbors who barely knew each other a month ago now laughed and celebrated together. Late that evening, as they were cleaning up, Mrs. Lee handed Alex a piece of paper. It was a tally of the day's fundraising. With the street fair proceeds, they had raised almost all of the remaining money needed. "You see," Mrs. Lee said, "sometimes the biggest gifts we can give aren't from our wallets, but from our hearts. You helped bring people together, and look what happened." Looking around at the community that had become his home, Alex realized that his decision wasn't just about helping one family anymore. It was about understanding what true wealth really meant. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, watching the sunset over the neighborhood he'd grown to love, Alex knew he was exactly where he needed to be. With only 3 days left in his month-long challenge, Alex was wiping down tables at morning light when his basic phone buzzed. It was Robert requesting their final weekly check-in. Alex stepped into the back alley, his heart pounding as he returned the call. Well, Robert's familiar voice came through. "You've made it further than I expected. Ready to come back to the real world." Alex looked through the coffee shop window at Mrs. Lee teaching Ray a new pastry recipe, at the regular customers chatting over their coffee, at the community bulletin board covered with thank you notes from Miss Chen's fundraiser. "This is the real world, Robert," he replied quietly. "But there's something I need to know. Why did you really propose this bet?" There was a long pause on the other end. When Robert spoke again, his voice had lost its usual competitive edge. "Take a walk with me tomorrow morning? There's something you should see." The next day, Alex met Robert at a small park near the coffee shop. His old rival looked strange in casual clothes, without his usual designer suit. "Follow me," Robert said, leading them down a familiar street. They stopped in front of the laundromat, where Alex had spent many evenings washing his clothes. 30 years ago, Robert began, "This was my mother's laundromat." Alex turned to him in surprise. "Yes, before I built my tech company, before the billions, this is where I grew up. Right here in this neighborhood." They walked past the grocery store, the park, and finally stopped in front of Morning Light. "This coffee shop," Robert continued, "used to be a small diner. I worked here as a dishwasher while putting myself through college. Mrs. Lee, she was a waitress back then." Alex's mind was spinning. "You knew? All this time?" Robert nodded. "When I heard you were planning to build luxury condos here, planning to tear down these buildings," he shook his head. "I knew you needed to understand what you'd be destroying." The revelation hit Alex like a punch to the gut. He remembered now, the development project he'd approved just before the bet. His company had bought most of the block, planning to replace these small businesses with high-end apartments. "The bet was never about the money, was it?" Alex asked. "Money's easy," Robert replied. "Understanding what's truly valuable, that's the hard part. I learned that lesson here, in these streets, watching people help each other even when they had nothing to spare." They walked in silence for a while, passing the spots where Alex had experienced so many small kindnesses over the past month. The place where the elderly neighbor had taught him how to properly sort his laundry. The corner where the local kids had helped him find his way when he got lost his first week. "What happens now?" Alex asked. "That's up to you," Robert said. "The bet ends in 2 days. You've proven you can live without your wealth. The question is, what have you learned about living with it?" Back at the coffee shop, Alex's mind was elsewhere as he made drinks and chatted with customers. He watched Miss Chen come in, looking happier than she had in weeks. The hospital interviews he'd arranged had gone well, and her mother's treatment was progressing. During his break, he sat with Mrs. Lee in the back office, surrounded by the smell of fresh bread and coffee. "Did you know?" he asked her. "About Robert?" She smiled that wise smile of hers. "I recognized him the moment he walked in to check on you that first week. He was a skinny dishwasher back then, but those kind eyes haven't changed. Why didn't you say anything?" "Some lessons," she said, patting his hand, "we need to learn for ourselves. You came here thinking you were pretending to be someone else. Instead, you found who you really are." That evening, after closing, Alex stood outside the coffee shop, looking up at the old building. He thought about the luxury condos in his original plans, with their sleek facades and premium prices. Then he thought about the lives lived within these one-brick walls, the community that had welcomed him, the people who had become his friends. He pulled out his phone and dialed Robert's number. "I need you to help me with something," he said when Robert answered. "It's about the development project." "Oh?" Robert's voice held a note of concern. "Yes," Alex said, watching the sunset paint the old buildings in warm colors. "I have a different idea for how to invest in this neighborhood." As he outlined his new plan, Alex felt lighter than he had in years. The bet had started as a challenge to live without his wealth. Instead, it had taught him the true meaning of being rich. Looking through the coffee shop window at the space that had become his second home, Alex knew that the real test wasn't surviving a month without his billions. The real test would be what he chose to do with them now that he understood their true purpose. 6 months later, the neighborhood was buzzing with activity, but not the kind anyone had expected. Instead of luxury condos rising from demolished buildings, the old structures were getting careful renovations. Workers carefully restored the historic facades while modernizing the interiors, preserving the character that made the area special. Alex stood in front of Morning Light, now sporting a fresh coat of paint, but still carrying its weathered charm. The bell chimed as he walked in, and the familiar smell of coffee and freshly baked bread wrapped around him like a warm hug. "There's our favorite investor," Mrs. Lee called from behind the counter. The coffee shop had expanded slightly, with a new community space in the back where local groups could meet. But the heart of it remained the same, a place where everyone felt welcome. Just here for my usual, Alex smiled, no longer wearing his designer suits but choosing simple, comfortable clothes instead. After the bet ended, he kept his promise to himself. His billions were now working for the community rather than against it. The neighborhood preservation project had become his passion. Instead of tearing down buildings, his company was helping small business owners upgrade their spaces while keeping rents affordable. The laundromat had new machines but kept its community bulletin board. The grocery store got better refrigeration units but maintained its policy of helping struggling families. Miss Chen walked in wearing her new hospital administrator uniform. After landing the job Alex had helped her find, she'd shown such impressive organizational skills that she'd been promoted within months. Her mother, now fully recovered, often volunteered at community events. "The youth center plans are ready for review," she told Alex, sliding into her usual seat. After seeing her leadership during the fundraiser, Alex had asked her to help run the neighborhood's new community development program. "Perfect timing," he replied. The construction team finished early on the building repairs. The youth center was being built in what used to be an abandoned warehouse, transformed into a space for after-school programs, job training, and community events. The door chimed again, and Robert walked in. Since revealing the truth about his connection to the neighborhood, he'd become a regular presence, sharing stories about his early days and mentoring young entrepreneurs at the community center. "Remember when you thought this bet was just about living without money?" Robert teased, ordering his coffee. Alex shook his head, smiling. "I thought I was so smart, figuring out how to survive on a budget. Turns out I was learning something much more valuable." The lesson had changed everything. After the bet ended, Alex had called a press conference, not to brag about winning, but to announce a complete shift in his company's approach to development. Instead of pushing communities out, they now worked to lift them up. The neighborhood became a model for responsible development. Other business leaders started visiting, learning how to invest in communities without destroying them. Alex's company created a fund to help other neighborhoods preserve their character while upgrading their infrastructure. "You know what's funny?" Mrs. Lee said, bringing them their drinks. "All those fancy development plans talked about building community, but we already had that. What we needed was someone to see its value." Alex looked around at the coffee shop filled with familiar faces. The retired teacher was helping a student with homework. The firefighter was chatting with the bookstore owner about their upcoming community safety workshop. The local artists had their work displayed on the walls, bringing color and life to the space. "I made more money than I ever dreamed of building tech companies," Alex said, "but I never built anything as meaningful as what I found here." Later that evening, during the monthly community dinner in the coffee shop's new gathering space, Alex stood up to make an announcement. The room quieted, filled with faces that had become like family. "6 months ago, I thought I was taking on a challenge to live without wealth," he began. "Instead, I discovered what true wealth really means. It's not in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's in the strength of our connections, in the way we lift each other up, in the communities we build together." He revealed his latest project, a foundation that would help other neighborhoods follow their model, preserving local businesses and communities while bringing in necessary improvements. Ms. Chen would co-direct it, bringing her first-hand experience and natural leadership skills to the role. "What started as a bet became something much more valuable, a truth I needed to learn," Alex concluded. "Real success isn't about how high you can climb alone. It's about how many people you can lift up with you." As the room erupted in applause and conversation, Alex caught Robert's eye across the room. His old rival raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. They both knew that the bet had changed far more than just one billionaire's perspective. It had created a ripple effect that would touch countless lives. The evening wound down with laughter, shared stories, and plans for the future. Walking home through the streets he'd grown to love, Alex realized that he'd never felt richer than he did right now, surrounded by a community that measured wealth not in dollars, but in the strength of its bonds and the kindness of its heart.